Hello, and welcome to Mars. What do you think is out there in space? There are stars and interstellar matter. Interstellar matter is all the material between the stars. This matter will contain dust, gas, and lots of different elements. And sometimes they'll shift and merge to form nebulae. Speaking of nebulae, I'm going to take you on a tour of the Milky Way to see some. But before we go, I'm going to give you some information to stick in your back pocket. We're going to run into three different types of nebulae. We're going to see an emission nebulae. This type is made with ionized gas, which emits light. Another type is going to be a reflection nebula. Reflection nebulae reflect light from nearby stars and scatter it. And the third type we'll see is a diffuse nebula. Diffuse nebulae are associated with forming stars. First up is the constellation Canis Major and the Seagull Nebula. This nebula is an emission nebula, as it is emitting its own light to form the Seagull. As we move on a little to the left, we'll run into the constellation Monoceros. Located here, we have the Rosette Nebula. It resembles a rose, and it is also an emission nebula. On the right, we have the Orion Nebula, located in the constellation of Orion, and it is a diffuse nebula. As I mentioned before, a diffuse nebula is a good place to form stars. We're going to take a short break here and learn about the formation of a star. Let's start with the recipe for a protostar. You have to begin with some interstellar gas and dust. We need a stellar pinch of helium, about 3 times as much hydrogen. Then keep adding gas and dust until it forms a dense dark cloud. Perfect! Now we have a dark nebula, or also known as a molecular cloud. Now let the dark nebula sit and work its mystery magic, and eventually the cloud ends up creating a lot of fuel. And somewhere in the process, the cloud ejects interstellar wind and gas, which is extremely hot. This causes explosions and more to happen. The gas ends up compressing the cloud, and if it gets compressed enough, the gas assisting the compression will form a protostar. Ta-da! This is now a protostar, which is a baby star that has not begun fusing helium in its core. And what happened to the dark nebula? It became the core of the protostar. If the protostar evolves, it will become a star. This nebula is very busy and dangerous, so let's move on. Here in the constellation Auriga, we have the Flaming Star Nebula. This nebula is an emission and a reflection nebula, which means it's emitting and reflecting light. How cool! Moving on, we have the California Nebula, located in the constellation Perseus. The California Nebula is supposed to resemble the state of California, and it's an emission nebula. Alright, last up, we have the constellation Cassiopeia and the emission nebula called the Pac-Man Nebula. Just kidding, this is a painting I did of the Pac-Man Nebula. This is the real Pac-Man Nebula. This is the end of the tour. Let's head back to Mars. Welcome back. Emission, reflection, and diffuse nebula are pretty cool, right? But there are even cooler ones. After protostars are created, they can form stars by fusing helium in their core. The stars then live their life. They live it up. They fuse, grow, shrink, maybe grow some more. They heat up, they cool down, can be a variety of different colors like red, blue, white, orange, yellow, and green. And then they eventually come to the end of their life. They throw one last party forming nebulae. Depending on the mass of the star, they can end up as a white dwarf or a neutron star. A low-mass star will most likely become a white dwarf. White dwarfs most likely end up as planetary nebula, which is a nebula that resembles a planet. After the star becomes a white dwarf, it ends up burning through a lot of its fuel and the different layers containing different elements. The core will be mainly formed of carbon and oxygen, and when that is used up, the star's core will shrink and heat up while it's getting compressed by the outer layers. The rest of the star will get very hot and form stellar wind and ultraviolet radiation. This will heat up the outside of the star called the shell and make it glow to form a planetary nebula. Some examples of planetary nebula are the Owl Nebula on the left, located near Ursa Major, and the Little Ghost Nebula on the right, located around the constellation of Pytheas. A star can also end up as a neutron star, and it throws an even bigger party called the supernova remnant. As a high-mass star is dying, the core gets compressed so much neutrons will degenerate and force the core to stop collapsing. This sends a shock through the star, and the energy that gets produced will be absorbed by the atomic nucleus. Inside the atomic nucleus, inside the core of the star, electrons and protons will now merge to form neutrons, which will release neutrinos. The neutrinos will deposit their energy in layers outside the core where there wasn't energy before. This reverses the fall of the layer inward and explodes it outwards. This is called a Type II supernova, and the explosion is so massive all that's left is the core. This core is called a neutron star, and what is left over is called the supernova remnant. A few different examples of the supernova remnant are the Manatee Nebula above, located by the constellation Aquila, and the Trench Nebula below, located near the constellation Dorado. After nebulae are created, they can grow, they can disperse, and then that's the end, right? Nope, this fairy tale doesn't end. After nebulae disperse, the gas, dust, and elements are still lingering around in space. And guess what? The process can start all over again. The gas and dust can form another or be part of multiple dark nebulae and become a protostar, and then a star. Stars are so cool, they recycle. And I think we can learn from them and recycle too.